Welcome, dear guests. I wish you all a good day. As History Plus, we are more than delighted to introduce you to our guest speaker, who is going to talk to us about the Central European University resistance against fascism and communism. This is a subject in which we should all be deeply interested because, as you know, many universities in Turkey, and especially our university, Boğaziçi University, have been trying to protect their academic freedom against the government. At this point, the subject that we will examine today within the scope of the Boğaziçi resistance offers us the opportunity to learn how universities acted against the totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. Our speakers' research interests are modern East and Central European political and social history, comparative education, history of nationalism and racism, history of Catholicism. Many of his books and articles have also been translated into languages such as German, Czech, Polish, and Ukrainian. The professor also holds many academic honors and awards. Dear guests, please join me in welcoming our guest speaker from University of California, Berkeley, Professor John Connelly.
Thank you very much for that very, very kind introduction. And also, I have to say, I feel it's a privilege to speak to you about some of my work. I'm going to talk about East Central Europe, but I'm going to go back a bit in history before doing that. And the first question I want to ask is whether we can say there's a relation between universities and the kind of political regime within which they operate. Is it possible that there is a free university that is an institution guaranteeing freedom of teaching and research in an unfree society, or a society living under conditions of non-democratic rule? The answer, at least in the distant past, is yes. Universities came into being in Europe's Middle Ages, time of feudalism, of the rule of kings and princes, and the religious supremacy of the Catholic Church. There was no modern sense of rights, and people enjoyed rights according to their status. Nobles more than commoners. But the rights that the nobles at least possessed were real, and kings or princes could not simply do what they wanted. They had to respect the will of nobles who met in their own councils. And increasingly also they had to respect the will of cities and towns. These were called corporations in the Middle Ages, in the feudal system. So when the university emerged in the 13th century, France and Italy and later Central Europe, it was also a corporation that was recognized as possessing rights by the monarch and by the church. Universities, in a sense, possessed not just rights, but they had privileges. They had freedom to do as they wished within certain boundaries. That also applied to students. And students, interestingly enough, were famous or infamous in the pre-modern period for often their rowdy behavior because they felt in some ways they were in a separate world that the state of that time could not enter. But if there was academic liberty, freedom of the university from outside interference, there was in an odd way in this very distant period, no need for academic freedom as we understand it. Teaching material was based in scholastic theology and philosophy, and was not open to the kind of unbridled questioning that we associate currently with freedom of research. Professors everywhere through Europe taught from the same small group of books, handwritten books. Now that would all change in the 16th and 17th centuries with the rise of humanism and the Enlightenment, people like Spinoza and Hume and Locke, and many others who pressed the boundaries of church orthodoxy. So that by the 16th century, universities, especially in Northern Europe, so Protestant Europe, became places where scholars could freely debate questions of philosophy and science without concern for infringing religious doctrine. The best known and most influential institution of that time, this is the 18th century, where academic freedom was really established in the modern sense, was the University of Göttingen in Northern Germany, Protestant Germany, founded in 1737. And later, the best known theoretical statement on the freedoms that pertained there and in other North German universities belongs to Immanuel Kant. He wrote an essay in 1798 called The Dispute of Faculties, and he demanded that a university should, at least in some faculty, provide a place which, as he said, in regard to its doctrines, is independent of the command of the government, has no command to give, but still has the freedom to judge everything that has to do with the scholarly or wissenschaftlich interest, that is, with the interest of truth. That particular faculty in German universities became known as the philosophical faculty. It was very broad at that time. Out of that later grew the philosophy departments, as well as history and all the social sciences, and including economics and sociology. But from the famous Prussian reforms of about a decade later, around 1808, 1809, the principle of freedom and of teaching and research was applied not just to that one faculty, but to the entire university, including the law faculty, medical faculty, even the theological faculty. A number of famous figures joined Kant in demanding freedom of scholarship. The most influential was Wilhelm von Humboldt. I should actually have a slide of him, who founded Berlin University in 1809, based upon the core principle of freedom of teaching and research. Humboldt's intention was to help reform the Prussian state, which had been under severe political pressure by France. But his conviction was that the freedom of inquiry and not control of inquiry ultimately served the state the best. A state grows through knowledge, and knowledge could only grow if its pursuit was unfettered, unlimited by the state. Therefore, at Berlin University, professors were in control. They determined what was taught, what they wrote, what they researched, who became one of them, who could become a student. The result by the late 19th century was that Germany was the center of the world as far as scholarship was concerned. And this model spread across the world, spread to the United States. The United States, my university is based on this German model, as are other universities in North America. Germany saw a flowering across disciplines of knowledge, of scholarship, philosophy, sociology, history, law, of course, the natural sciences. Academic freedoms were guaranteed even under the neo-absolutism of the Prussian state, and later under the what I would call pseudo-liberalism of Otto von Bismarck's Imperial Germany. After 1849, Prussia, the largest state in Germany, had a constitution, and people lived within the rule of law, known as Rechtsstaat. So the great question, I'm going to jump into the 20th century regarding Germany, is how did these universities then succumb to Nazism, to National Socialism? I say succumb because they were not simple victims, but to a large degree willingly assented to the the rise of right-wing extremism. This gets back to the first question, the relation of the university and the political order. Simply because universities possessed rights of self-government and very significant freedoms, and enjoyed and indeed needed the protections of the liberal state in the 20th century, did not mean that their members, that is, professors and students, supported liberal democracy. In fact, universities were places of strongly felt nationalism, often extreme among students. So in many places, students, rather than oppose Nazism, generally assented and supported it. This fact, I think, shows the extraordinary force of a modern ideology called nationalism in general, and how it can blind even university members of the mission of the university. After all, university is meant to be universal and not limited to one subject, one approach, one doctrine, let alone one race. But this problem of extreme nationalism was not unique to Germany. Across Europe, if you were to look for proponents of extremism in the 1930s, you would find them at universities, in particular among students. Romania, Poland, for example, Hungary, France. In Germany, some professors did protest, and of course, many left for North America in many cases, left for Turkey. One of my colleagues actually was born in Turkey in 1945. His family had escaped Nazi Germany. So it would be incorrect to say that there was absolutely no opposition. And as a point of light, I might mention in the German story, although resistance was relatively limited at universities, there was during the war a tenacious resistance movement among dozens of students, the so-called White Rose movement, led by students of theology and medicine. So here are the two most prominent you see on this slide, Hans and Sophie Scholl. They felt that the Hitler regime was a scandal, In fact, they called Hitler the Antichrist, and they read subversive literature among themselves, including a lot of theology and philosophy. If they had an orientation, I would say it was Christian, humanist Christian. They were Protestants, they were Catholics, and there was an important Orthodox member of their group as well. They were partly supported by some professors of philosophy. Ultimately, this group was destroyed. Here's another photo from, I think, 1942, before the young men were to go off to the Eastern Front. This is taken in Munich. They were partly supported by professors, but ultimately destroyed by the Gestapo. What happened was that a janitor denounced the students for dropping anti-Nazi pamphlets in the main hall of the University of Munich in early 1943. The students responsible, this young woman here, they were apprehended and executed by the Nazi regime by the guillotine, early 1943. I'll give you a sense of one of their spirit. So these leaflets, they were very direct in their messages. The present state is the dictatorship of evil. We've known that for a long time, I hear you object. And it isn't necessary to bring that to our attention again, but I ask you, if you know that, why do not bestir yourselves? Further down, do not hide your cowardice behind a cloak of expediency, for with every new day that you hesitate, failing to oppose this offspring of hell, Hitler, your guilt, as in a parabolic curve, grows higher and higher. This is the last photo, by the way, of Sophie Scholl. There's very good literature on this that I can suggest to you. They didn't manage to overturn the Hitler regime. But after the war, they were thought of by the two German states, East and West Germany, as representing what Germans should have done. This is how Germans should have behaved. The interesting thing, now I'm going to move to Eastern Europe, is that there were Hans and Sophie Scholl streets and schools and celebrations, in a way, in both communist East Germany as well as democratic West Germany. So why would a communist dictatorship celebrate people who had risen up against dictatorship? The reason, you have to think a little bit like Marxist-Leninists, at least rhetorically, had to do with the failure of the German research university in the capitalist system. So communists asked, whose interests did universities really serve? Ultimately, they argued, it seemed that legions of students, associate and full professors, had served the interests of an imperial racist order. And in the Marxist-Leninist understanding that dominated in East Germany after 1945, that meant they had served the interests of the most extreme reactionary elements of capitalism. Therefore, the only solution for higher education in the new post-war order was to place the university under the strict control of the working class. And that meant the Marxist-Leninist Party. After 1945, university autonomy was done away with. Professors could no longer choose the rector, no longer choose what to write or teach. This, in fact, was a system that, as you can tell from what I've said, was far into the European tradition. It came from the Soviet Union, but the Soviet system that was introduced in Eastern Europe after 1945 stood against that European tradition of freedom of teaching and research. Now, did universities resist this attack on their rights? The answer is yes. There was resistance to communist takeover in the countries that I've studied, not only East Germany, but also Czechoslovakia and Poland. But I think at the outset, one has to make a basic distinction when talking about this resistance, perhaps using a military metaphor. So on the one hand, there was what one might call a frontal assault. Students and occasionally teachers taking to the streets and openly opposing communist power peacefully with banners and slogans, attempting to make themselves seen and heard in public spaces. And on the other is what one might call an academic insurgency, the work in favor of independent life of the university taking place beyond public places, beyond the view of public officials in unofficial ways. For example, among professors who decide outside university premises among themselves to protect endangered students. For example, by finding a slot at their own institution for students who may have been expelled at another, or among students who insisted, often beyond university premises, but sometimes on them, to self-organize, to take responsibility for their own intellectual lives and protect it by reading and talking about history or poetry or sociology without permission, sometimes in cafes, sometimes in private homes and dormitories. usually with some contact to professors. So this first sort of protest, the open one, occurred in all three countries. Yet the latter sort, what I called sort of an insurgency, unofficial organization, that really occurred only in Poland. Question is why? I believe this latter form proved the most effective way of protecting the university as a place for free inquiry. I should note that in all three places, universities shared this German tradition of freedom of teaching and research. But I'll start with the East German case. So after 1945 in East Germany, Soviet authorities, if you think of your history, Soviet authorities were in control of East Germany. They quickly acted to seize control. They did permit universities to reopen in 1945 and 1946. It's Berlin, Greifswald, Rostock, Leipzig, Halle, cleansed for the most part the teaching faculties of members of the Nazi Party. But when the university faculty of Greifswald gathered in February 1946 for a reopening of that institution, the event was very strange. The rector, whose face you see here, who should have presided, was nowhere to be seen. He wasn't present at the opening of the university. Word arrived, word by rumor, that he had been arrested. This man's name was Ernst Lohmeyer. He was a theologian. He had simply disappeared, it seemed. Decades later, it emerged, so after 1989, that he had been executed in the fall of 1946. Now, Lohmeyer was not a member of the Nazi Party. And in fact, he had been punished by the Nazi regime. He had actually been sent to Greifswald as punishment. But I discovered years later in a discussion with a communist official who had been in conversation with Soviets at that time in 1946, the man's name was Robert Rompa, that the Soviets had told him that Lohmeyer, this theologian, had been a Wehrmacht officer, so a German army officer who had overseen the execution of Soviet prisoners of war during the war. It's not true to the extent to which that was true. There was no trial. What this was an act of terror meant to intimidate the university communities. In the years that followed, the communist authorities came to appoint their own trusted rectors and deans. Interestingly enough, this is somewhat ironic, it turned out that a number of these rectors and deans appointed by the communists themselves were former Nazis. I couldn't find a picture of this fellow. He was a chemist. He was a rector of the University of Greifswald from 1950 to 1954 during the high period of Stalinism. What the communist authorities discovered was that these former Nazis were more pliable. So, for example, this Professor Hans Bayer, he had been not just a Nazi Party member in the 1930s, he had been a really enthusiastic Nazi. He liked to make sure that people in the Chemistry Institute would raise their arms in the so-called German salute and say Heil Hitler. So this is the kind of person who, in a sense, had his, how shall we put it, his moral authority broken under Nazism. He was the perfect kind of person that the communists could use as a rector. So that was his position between 1950 and 1954. As a whole, because the professoriate in East Germany was heavily Nazified, it could not convincingly stage resistance against a regime that, as communists, claimed to be anti-fascist. That was the rhetoric of that time. Former Nazis were true servants of communism. But the same was not true of East German students. Now I'll talk a bit about East German students. What happened as early as 1945, in the sign of what was called at the time democratization, was that students were permitted to elect candidates to their own student councils. They had their own representation. Majorities, it turned out, were non-communists. That is, they were Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and liberals. What was unusual and interesting about the students elected to these student councils is that they tended to come from a group that was relatively small in Germany. I said there wasn't much resistance at universities. They tended to come from a group of intellectuals and students who had stood against the Nazi regime. They had been involved in anti-Nazi resistance. And what these students said was that this new order, supposed anti-fascist order, in fact, reminded them of the dictatorial order that they had lived under and suffered under Nazism. So one example of a person who felt this way, this Wolfgang Natonik, I had actually the privilege of meeting him in the early 1990s. He was a liberal student leader in Leipzig. He had no intention of going into politics, but one day he was sitting in a lecture hall and somebody said to him, "Is it your turn, mistaking him for someone else. He said, "Is it your turn to take notes to the SED party headquarters, the Communist Party headquarters, or is it mine today?" And what Natznik understood, and he couldn't believe it, is that the very same practice used under Nazism, that students would sit and spy on each other in lecture halls, was now being instituted under communism. So he decided he had to get involved, and he did. He was the student council leader in Leipzig until 1948. There's a statement of his from May 1948: "Science must be free from any political influence. Scientists must nevertheless be politically aware." He thought that there was a way in which, despite this Humboldtian idea that science should be free, that still scholars had the duty to be politically aware. He was arrested by Soviet military officials and was in a prison until 1956 when he was released, along with dozens of other anti-communist student leaders. Some of them never came back. Actually, he survived and went on to West Germany to continue his studies after 6 years in prison. I'm sorry, 8 years in prison. Maybe on a more positive note, there were other students, mainly from East Berlin, who were involved in creating a new university in West Berlin, in sectors controlled by the Western Allies. We know that university as the Free University of Berlin. But after 1948, there really was very little resistance in East Germany, partly because of the open border to the West. People could escape if they wanted to and be in their same country, partly because the communist dictatorship selected students who were unlikely to resist. So now a few words about Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was relatively free between 1945 and 1948, with a very strong presence of communists at the universities, especially among students, but also the presence of liberal and social democratic students. Czechoslovakia shows compellingly how the fate of the university follows the politics of society more generally. In February 1948, communists forcibly seized power throughout the country, purging all institutions of civil society, like newspapers and political parties, but also schools and universities. Communist students dominated the university party organizations and decided in April 1948 to kick out the rector. They did that on their own, not even waiting for a directive to come from the party leadership, which had by that point usurped control of the Czechoslovak government. But before that happened, so going back to February 1948, there was one of the events, the sort of events that I referred to above, a sort of pitched battle, open confrontation in February 1948, in the days when the communists were wresting power in a sudden coup d'etat. Thousands of Christian, liberal, and socialist students, moderate socialist students, staged 2 marches from the university across the river up to the castle in Prague, urging the Czechoslovak president Edvard Beneš to act in defense of democracy against the armed communist police and militia that were dominating the streets and seizing power. Students, this may sound grandiose, were like the conscience of society. They were generally liberal, democratic oriented, very strong left wing to be sure, very weak fascism among Czechoslovak students. And this, I think, largely has to do with the imprint of a Czech national hero, Czechoslovak national hero. The first president of Czechoslovakia, 1918, was himself a professor of philosophy and sociology, a very tolerant liberal man, T.G. Masaryk. And he was adamantly opposed to totalitarianism, fascism, and the like. So in a sense, it was not to be a proper Czech, to be in favor of a total order of that type. To be fascist was somehow to be out of touch with Czechoslovak ideals. Now, as you know, perhaps from European history, the communist movement arose nevertheless in Czechoslovakia because that liberal state proved unable to protect Czechoslovak sovereignty in 1938 and 1939. But note, in 1939, there were marches against Nazi incursion, and they were staged by students. So as in 1948, students were at the forefront of the forces within Czechoslovak society demanding that democratic rule be respected. That was true also in 1968, as well as 1989. At each of these crucial moments, students were the most prominent element in Czech society demonstrating for liberty, free elections, and civil rights. Okay, now for Poland, which is in some ways the most important subject. In the early post-war period, there were some open efforts at resistance. Students and professors sensed the creeping Sovietization, the gradual attempts of the state to reduce university autonomy, for example, by making the rector an appointee of the government minister. And students as well as professors protested either by going onto the streets or calling meetings, open meetings, for example, of rectors across Poland without government approval. At one such meeting in March of 1947, professors from Warsaw said that a state law limiting their ability to control their own affairs was, quote, not Polish in spirit. For in Poland, the university has enjoyed autonomy since the end of the 14th century. Note the nationalist argument being made. The previous year, students had demonstrated all over Poland, 1946, against the state's decision to replace the traditional national holiday with the International Workers' Holiday of May 1st. The traditional national holiday in Poland is May 3rd, commemorating Poland's first constitution in 1791. In this event, in one city alone, Poznań, some 633 students were arrested. So in both of these cases, professors and students attempted to make use of the national narrative for their own purposes. They claimed it was necessary to protect the university as a vital national institution. But as elsewhere, by 1948, open opposition was pretty much broken. This was a time of terror. A word I haven't used but should use is Stalinism. This was the Stalinist period. Huge numbers of political prisoners throughout Eastern Europe. Still, Polish university communities remained lively and not fully controlled. Professors may have been kept from electing their own representatives, may have been asked to teach new courses, for example, in socialist law or Marxist philosophy, but still, when the lecture hall room doors closed, in very many cases, they still taught as they saw fit. They possessed in many cases a kind of personal courage that was absent among German or even Czech professors who had been mostly passive under Nazi occupation. In Poland, by contrast, a good number of professors had defied the Nazi authorities and taught in the underground at the risk of their lives in secret universities, often meeting in private apartments conspiratorially, that is using pseudonyms and changing the meeting place each week. That's why these underground universities were sometimes called flying universities. They would move about cities. So a lecture or a seminar would take place in a different apartment every week. The practice of underground teaching under Nazi occupation was so widespread across Poland's territory and also at the high school level. Nazi authorities had closed both high schools and universities in 1939, that when the war ended in 1945, thousands of diplomas could be issued. Thus, the professors who had defied Nazism at the risk of their lives were not easily intimidated during Stalinism in their contacts with students. Yet the young generation also did not live up to the communist expectations. A good number of students had also taken part in the underground conspiracy during the war and continued to meet unofficially during Stalinism as they had under Nazism for intellectual, academic, and cultural purposes. Precisely because they were at pains to evade state surveillance, there are few records today of this activity in state archives. But life stories that we have of individual students, former students, give us a sense of the reach of underground academic activity. For example, take Jan Józef Lipski. It's one of my heroes. He's the man on the left. This is a later photo. This is taken in the 1970s. Jan Józef Lipski, a prominent writer, well-known figure in the Polish opposition at a later point. He had been an underground resistor during the war as a young man, and it didn't cease this sort of conspiratorial activity after the war. And from the war all the way till his death in 1991, he was involved in some kind of unofficial non-state conspiracy or another. For example, in 1945, he and his friends organized what they called a Pickwick Club, after Dickens, I think, a group of skeptics. They thought of themselves as neo-positivists. They were anti-romantics in the Polish tradition. We might call them left liberals. They liked the philosophy of Karl Popper, if you've heard of Karl Popper. They liked the poetry of Czesław Miłosz. And they would meet unofficially over coffee and vodka in bars in Warsaw and talk about these things and organize in some senses their own knowledge. Unaware that Stalinism was supposed to atomize societies, they and other students formed other kinds of uncontrollable parallel clubs. There were philologists and sociologists and historian, they called them circles, research circles, had an older tradition in Poland, but they reemerged and they continued, and the state did not and could not really stop students from forming them. I myself took part in activities of one of these sort of clubs when I was a student in communist Poland in the 1980s. It was a much safer time, but this is a very old tradition. The word in Polish is koło naukowe, which means scientific circle. But there were other kinds of organizations. There were Catholic organizations of students devoted, for example, to the cult of the Virgin Mary. There were Marxists, unofficial Marxists, who organized their own discussion groups, even during Stalinism. Various shades of Marxism. And in all of these groups after the war, it was former underground resistance fighters who provided, I think, the backbone. The secret police made occasional arrests, wasn't completely beyond what they knew about, but they could never control, because this organizing was so massive, they couldn't really control it, they couldn't stop it. I'm talking about Warsaw, but this sort of organizing extended to all university towns, about 24 of them. Now, to shift the narrative a little bit, this underground unofficial organizing exploded at regular intervals into public consciousness when university students indeed took to the streets. It happened first in 1956, a time of general relaxation of political life in Poland after Khrushchev revealed Stalin's crimes. This was a revolutionary year, 1956, when Poland and the Soviet Union almost went to war. Much of Polish society was organizing in favor of reform. Students were no exception. They created new clubs all over Poland, or they revivified existing structures. For example, socialist Marxist structures were revivified. They often had, so for example, in Krakow, there was a group that called itself the Red Tomato. Don't ask me why they call themselves that. But they then created a revolutionary student committee in 1956, which had political ambitions, liberalizing, reforming, breaking Stalinist orthodoxy. They also created they called a revolutionary youth movement to get to make contact to high school students. Elsewhere, students created new organizations to supplant the waning power of the official communist student movement. Students elected their own leaders in their research circles. They wrote for and published very critical, largely independent press. This is sort of a moment of freedom, 1956, early 1957. 1957, repression becomes the rule again in communist Poland under a new communist regime. Władysław Gomułka, he seemed a reformer, he turned out not to be a reformer. So student activism had to then retreat and return to these informal structures. For example, to student theater. I find it's a charming part of the Polish story. Polish satirical student theater, it looks as though it's frivolous and not serious. In fact, this was a legal outset for a very political dissent. In the late, these student satirical clubs existed all over Poland, Gdańsk, Warsaw, Krakow, Western Poland, Eastern Poland. Good friends of mine, their parents actually were involved in this. They got to know each other in the 1950s. Looking back from about 20 years distance, a sociologist named Elżbieta Morawiec analyzed the role of this student theater. She said the following, which I think is very interesting. It was the phenomenon at its core of student theater was not a game. It was the act of conveying the truth, the personal truth, and the truth of the theater group, which is a community. Right? These are unofficial, uncontrolled communities, these theaters. The truth in student ensembles for the first time concerns a private man, woman, his, her philosophy, and psychosocial behavior, spontaneity, and disinclination for empty phraseology, idealism, hidden behind irony, and a sense of humor full of the absurd, talking in their own name and about themselves, actors and actresses of student theaters brought to life their own audience, the audience of their own generation and beliefs. The social group became a tool of communication independent of official culture. Incredibly important for imagine the masses of students who saw theater across Poland, essentially taking control of this group away from the Communist Party. So what about the famous 1960s? The 1960s is a time of student rebellion across the world. There's a new age cohort that comes in the 1960s. And when they arrived at universities in the mid-60s, they were already activated. Political socialization of students in Warsaw, for example, it turns out had already started in high schools. In Warsaw's high schools, for instance, in the early 1960s, there were unofficial discussion clubs that emerged, often with a left liberal agenda, supported by left-leaning independent professors. For example, in 1962, under the patronage of the philosopher Adam Schaff, high school students in Warsaw founded a club that they called the Club of Seekers of Contradictions. And here they are. Leading figures included, I think I can indicate this man here. This is Adam Michnik as a boy. And this man here, young man, this is Jan Gross. These are now very, very famous figures in Polish public life. This is them in high school. When they and their friends then went beyond high school and enrolled, here they are again. This is a better quality picture from the same sort of event. This is a meeting of this club when they're still high school students. 1965, they went to university to study history and sociology. They became known as commandos. That was the name that they, again, this sort of military metaphor, for their habit of provoking party officials during events. This group stood at the center of revolutionary youth at the university. And later, Michnik recalled, they were always mulling over what would happen next. They tended to feel invulnerable because they believed state authorities would never violate university terrain. A high point of their collaboration took place in 1966 when this man at the center of this photo, Leszek Kolakowski, a Polish philosopher, gave a long lecture about the situation of Poland after a decade after 1956, basically saying Poland had become a country without hope. And for this speech organized by the students, Kolakowski was expelled from the party and then later from the university. 1968 is the high point of tensions between the party and these independent groups at the University of Warsaw. They exploded into the open because of a drama that took place on a stage in Warsaw in January of 1968, more accurately because a drama, that is a play, was removed from a stage in Warsaw. On January 30th, 1968, the government shut down a play called Forefathers' Eve, which had been written in 1832 by Poland's famous romantic bard, poet Adam Mickiewicz, at Warsaw's National Theater. The reason they did so is because the play was written in the 1830s, but because Poland was occupied by Russia at that point, it had allusions critical of Russia. At the last performance of this play, before it was shut down, students crowded up to the stage, and as the curtain descended, began chanting "Independence without censorship." Then several hundred of them marched to nearby Adam Mickiewicz monument in central Warsaw with banners and chants, "Down with censorship, we want Mickiewicz's truth." Police dispersed them, arresting over 3 dozen. Historically, only Russian and German occupiers had actually violated the terrain of Polish universities. Therefore, on March 8th, 1968, when they staged a manifestation against censorship at Warsaw University, students felt safe. State authorities had a weaker sense of national decorum. Midway through the manifestation, trucks rolled up before the main university gate and out jumped police as well as armed workers' units, swinging clubs, arresting. Students chanted "Gestapo, Gestapo." And they also began singing the Polish national anthem. Soon after this crackdown, and here's, by the way, that these are photographs of the police gathering around the university premises and students desperately escaping down major street in Warsaw in March of 1968. But the news that the university had been violated spread throughout Poland, and in the weeks that followed, university and high school students went out into the streets from one end of Poland to the other, marching and chanting and streaming to Mickiewicz statues where they existed, sometimes almost overwhelming police units. It wasn't until the 1990s when archives opened that we realized the full extent of these protests. They were one of the most massive protests that actually hit the Eastern Bloc up till that point. However, gradually the demonstrators' energies waned. This happened, by the way, in Paris in this very time as well. Weeks of mass arrests, restructurings, threats of closure, swelling numbers of police wore young people out, and the protests subsided. Many students were drafted into the army, and those who had been detained by the police returned to their homes, in Adam Michnik's words, shattered. But the story is not over. As is the case with all universities, within a few years, there's a new cohort. New students come to the university with their own ideas and expectations. And by the mid-1970s, the unofficial ferment of this compulsive self-organizing of students continued. And in 1976, various elements coalesced. That year, the man already mentioned, Adam Michnik, by this point in his 30s, decided to create a completely new kind of unofficial organization, partly involving professors and students, called CORE, the Committee for the Defense of Workers. These were intellectuals, including not just professors, but also poets and legal scholars, whose purpose was to use their know-how to assist workers who were being persecuted by the state for demonstrating against the catastrophic economic situation in Poland. In May 1977, one of CORE's student members, so the Committee of Defense of Workers in Krakow, died after a fall in his apartment house. Police said that this student had been drunk, but his friends suspected that there had been foul play, that he had actually been pushed out of this apartment. And so the Committee for Defense of Workers had a martyr, and students commemorated this martyrdom. Some 5,000 students, as well as workers, attended his funeral, May 15th of 1977. And afterward, a group carrying black flags marched to the house where P.S.'s body had been found and observed a minute of silence. That evening at about 9 p.m., a crowd returned to the site for a march to the castle above the city of Krakow with candles, and again, black flags. Estimates of the size of that crowd range upwards of 10,000 under communist Poland. The crowd was thick with security forces, but they hesitated to intervene, fearing a bloodbath in which they themselves might be victims. Students, for their part, were very disciplined. They didn't respond to provocation. At the castle, one read a declaration announcing the formation of another unofficial committee, the Student Solidarity Committee. A minute of silence followed. Then the national anthem was sung and the crowd dispersed peacefully. Despite warnings from university authorities and state authorities, students mobilized in other cities as well in similar patterns. Memorial service followed by a march, and there were reports from all over Poland of this happening. I'm going to move down a bit. Now this underground organizing of students combined with underground organizing of workers and others, people in the church, outside of the church, so that by 1978, 1979, there was a huge underground press, unofficial press, as well as, interestingly enough, unofficial universities. This organizational form that emerged during the war of flying universities, of university lectures and seminars taking place in private apartments, sometimes on university premises when no one was looking, and teaching things that couldn't be taught in the state-run institutions. So there aren't many pictures of this because it was an illegal, unofficial activity. But here's obviously a case in the 1970s when the students, as well as obviously some elderly people like myself, faculty members, managed to get hold of premises. It looks to me like maybe a library somewhere in Warsaw, where where somebody got a key and let other people in for this lecture. There were also seminars that met off campus. Oh, and by the way, I'll just allude to this. These are pictures from the deeper past. So these are people involved in conspiratorial education during World War II. These are women secretly learning to be teachers. They were forbidden to do so by the Nazi authorities. And at an even earlier point in the 1890s, there were efforts by women, actually led by women, to create unofficial ways of training teachers because the Russian authorities wouldn't permit this to happen in Polish culture. So what was happening in the 1980s was, in 1970s and 1980s, interestingly enough, was something that people's parents and grandparents had been involved in. So that shows you in some ways the power of culture. So the year 1980, just to sort of conclude the discussion of Poland, was an explosion of dissent, even greater than 1956 and 1968, involving worker strikes, university boycotts, finally forcing the regime to recognize an independent trade union, which was called Solidarity, which lasted from August 1980 until December 1981. Then it went underground. Communist authorities forced it underground. They declared martial law. They arrested its leaders, including, by the way, this fellow Adam Michnik was one of its leaders. But this organization, Solidarity, was also present at all universities, and universities elected their own solidarity committees, faculty, students, et cetera. So to conclude the discussion of Poland, I would say this was a self-organizing civil society that effectively made communism in Poland unworkable, and which, from the mid-1980s, after the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, seized opportunities for liberalization and democratization, and had support even within the communist regime by the late 1980s. All of these forces got together by 1989 and negotiated an end to communism. So at this table are representatives of the church, of workers' trade unions, of the Communist Party, of course, but also of the university. Several of the most prominent figures at this roundtable that concluded communism were professors. So do I have a little bit more time? Ahmed, maybe I'll make some concluding remarks, and then we can perhaps have some discussion.
Yeah.
So maybe five or so more minutes. So first point, this Polish self-organizing society dates from the deep past and continues into the present. For example, a few years ago, there was a very restrictive abortion law, and suddenly across Poland, women were on the streets. It was unplanned. It was provoked. It was unplanned, and suddenly there was something called a women's movement. Poles conspire. They've been doing it for a long time. Even in the early modern period, the Polish nobility, I talked about the nobility early on, had rights to organize in their own interests, in their own sort of parliaments. They even had the right to elect their own kings. This fact of early Polish democracy, extending back centuries, I think contests the widespread idea that the East of Europe is somehow behind the West. Parts of the East had very strong traditions of self-government. Poland was one such place. I should introduce a note of caution. I think it's unfortunate in my talk that I've used these military metaphors. And it's strange that terms otherwise suggesting subversive anti-state activity are the kinds of terms I've been using, like conspiracy and underground. These are applied to the Polish intelligentsia and its penchant for organizing in favor of its own interests. All students were doing in cafes and private apartments was availing themselves of the standard human right to discuss matters of common concern. It was the Nazi, then the communist state, that forced them to do so in hidden spaces, smoky bars, dorm rooms, private apartments, trying to stay one step ahead of the police. To be clear, in a normal modern liberal order, there is nothing subversive about discussing history. And the kind of state that calls such discussions subversive is one that is uncertain about its own legitimacy. But note, when the self-organizing happened in post-war Poland, it was done not just with some specific local tangible interest in mind. It was not about the concerns of one faculty at the University of Lublin or the higher pedagogical school in Opola. It was not about wages or stipends. The professors and students always made clear that their acts had broader national meaning, whether it was an underground journal of poetry or professors gathering to protest interference in university autonomy. The point was always to protect something of inestimable value: Polish culture, the special heritage of the Polish nation, something fragile and contingent that was worth living and perhaps dying for. And people did risk their lives during World War II to do precisely that. This is important to emphasize. Students were implicitly marching or conspiring in order to protect universal human rights, but the cause they invoked directly and explicitly was that of the nation. So I think there's this tendency in the West often to condemn, populism, let us say in Hungary or Poland, as somehow being the natural rhetoric or the natural product of so-called nationalism. The point is that kind of nationalism, intolerant nationalism, has to be met with an enlightened, tolerant kind of nationalism. That is one very strong strand of the Polish tradition. Now, this sort of student activity, organizing, didn't happen everywhere. It didn't happen in East Germany. Even in 1989, students were relatively quiet there. Resonant student activism happened where the narrative of the preeminent value of academic freedom coincided with the message that the university is vital to the nation's prospering, indeed to the nation's survival. It was a resonant message also in Czechia in 1989, and their students were also at the forefront of the revolution. Here they are in Brno, making placards and posters in November of 1989. But as we know, nationalism is also a very tricky quantity. It was necessary as a kind of structure, a backbone to sustain university opposition against totalitarianism in Poland or Czechoslovakia. But we also know that an extreme nationalism came to dominate and undo the university in liberal Germany, in Weimar Germany. But one should, as I've just suggested, one should differentiate. And I think the difference is pretty clear. Nationally motivated students in Poland and Czechoslovakia salvaged the basic values of the university, freedom of research and teaching, and also made it a bulwark for liberal democratic values in their societies. They were at the forefront of revolution for freedom in 1989 and at other points. Then while Nazi students in Germany destroyed both the university and liberal democracy, the free spirit of the university can, and I would say should, be a beacon for a free and open society. But that does not mean that students cannot fall prey to radical ideologies. So finally, to speak a little bit of liberalism, which is a very, very contested quantity, to return to the point that I made at the outset, it's true that the university did not emerge under the aegis of a modern liberal order, right? The medieval university, far from it. It arose from an old status society that has since disappeared from the earth. In Europe and much of the world, the idea of unequal rights in corporations enjoyed by institutions living in a bubble, protected from, let us say, civil law, is unheard of. This notion was, generally speaking, shattered by the French Revolution and gradually replaced by an order based on rule by consensus and a sense of equality of citizenship, equality of rights, protections under the law. This is a sort of order that was largely established, or in the process of being established, within Europe virtually everywhere, west of Russia, by the year 1900. The 20th century saw this liberal order radically challenged by the two totalitarian regimes I've been talking about in this speech. These regimes did not respect either civil rights or Humboldt's ideals of free teaching and research. They did all they could to make citizenries and universities useful to the state. Thus, in our world, it seems that only a modern liberal order can secure the university the protected space it needs to carry out its missions. Still, to repeat the point, the case of Germany shows that universities can also be complicit in illiberalism and bring about their own destruction. Yet Poland, more hopefully, suggests that university communities have resources to resist encroaching controls, even when the regime controls the street and public order. Poland shows that self-organization, the countless interactions between students and teachers, is something that even a totalitarian government cannot stop. So that is that's my last word. Thank you for your attention, and I think we may have some time for questions.
Thank you for your great speech, and thanks for the guests for the questions. I'm starting with the first question. When did this pressure on universities in Iron Curtain countries and the resistance of universities end? What kind of change occurred as a result of the loss of power and eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union?
So this is a question about the situation after 1989.
Yes, I believe.
Yeah. So, well, you know, nowadays I think we're I think a bit more sobered, maybe skeptical about the way in which 1989 had ushered in completely liberal order. You know, in Eastern Europe, but also at universities. I would say that the story has been quite positive, with some exceptions. But in all these countries, there was some ways a receding of this unofficial sort of resistance, and students went about and got their degrees. When I entered Prague in 1990, 1991. A lot of these students who had been involved in the revolution, they were at that point they were involved in publishing. They were moving into their careers, and you know, new cohorts, as is always the case with universities, had emerged. And you know, my sense is basically that universities fulfilled the task of universities, and when they've been challenged in Poland and in Hungary, they've attempted to resist. The problem, as you know, in Hungary is that the regime has been very forceful, going so far actually as to close a university, and that did engender rather significant protests in the streets of Budapest, but it couldn't stop the legal decrees from taking effect. I'll just say maybe as a more positive note is that when I was at Budapest early last year to give a talk, the rector, Michael Ignatieff, president, I think he's called, said that you know, universities outlive political regimes. So although the Central European University has moved much of its activities to Vienna, it's planning on actually returning someday, because you see this also in Eastern Europe, other places in Eastern Europe, that these various illiberal regimes have a limited life. So I would say, generally speaking, that East European universities, this includes Romania, certainly Poland, Slovakia, they've returned to the world of international scholarship after a long rupture.
For the second question, was there a significant body of scholars who remained in West Germany and continued to pursue their Nazi ideas?
That's a good question. So the teaching faculties in West Germany, the natural science, the medical faculties, the law faculties were dominated by former Nazis. Actually, I've seen, and this is true in East Germany as well. There simply weren't other professors around. So what one had by the 1950s and 1950s, more or less silence in West Germany about the Nazi past, but then by the 1960s, open confrontation among, I would say, younger groups, including students, who claimed precisely that their professors were compromised. But I would say in general, and one could talk at greater length about this, that this open confrontation with people who had been active in the Nazi regime in civil society meant that West Germany actually did face a whole range of very, very difficult questions: responsibility for terror, for the camps, the responsibility of academia, responsibility of historians. All of these things have been dealt with. Responsibility of workers, responsibility of the legal profession, the medical profession. All these things have been dealt with within mostly West German society in a way that I think is exemplary. East Germany, on the other hand, essentially the regime claimed that it had done away with capitalism, and therefore one didn't need to talk about the past of its professors, among whom there were many former Nazi Party members. But that would be a brief answer to the question. But I would say in general that non and anti-Nazi streams of argumentation were, even in the 1950s, former Nazis tended to, it's strange actually, under a new regime, former Nazis often contributed very decent historical scholarship. I work on Eastern Europe, so some of the professors whose work I've used actually were German professors who were active in Nazi occupation of Eastern Europe. And what's interesting is after the war, they then produced pretty good, decent scholarship. So sometimes it's the regime that matters more than the individual decision.
Okay, for the third question, it may seem like a strange question, but I want to ask this. There was a lot of pressure on universities and academics in Czechoslovakia under the communist regime. In the same area in Prague in the 14th century, Jan Hus, a reformist, was dismissed by the church and his followers were expelled from the university. He was eventually burned to death for his ideas. How can we make a connection between these two periods?
Well, Hus became, an ethnically or culturally Czech university was reestablished after years of Austrian-German rule in the early 1880s. And Hus was a major figure that they considered to represent the Czech spirit. And in fact, what the Czech national movement did is they actually rebuilt the church where he preached. He and the Protestant, the proto-Protestant movement and the Hussite movement in the Czech lands were thought to represent an ancient Czech spirit of tolerance, democracy, and dissent, enlightenment. So the fellow that I showed you is maybe the best person to make this point with. Thomas Masaryk was born in 1850. He was born actually of Catholic parents, but he left the Catholic Church and became a sort of a Protestant. He became, in other words, he connected to this earlier, you might call it Hussite tradition, this dissenting tradition within Czech Christianity, and this was the dominant trend in the Czech intellectual class after the 1880s, and after 1918, after this point when he was president of the country, a Hussite church was reestablished. So I would just say that, you know, historically Czechs are very aware that they had this early modern dissent movement that was crushed by imperial authorities, by church authorities, and they've tried to recreate it and under the motto precisely of freedom of thought. The slogan that's used, you may have heard of, is "Truth will be victorious." That's associated with Hussite movement. That was also Masaryk's main slogan, and it's obviously one that can be used at the university. So the Hussitism and this tradition of Jan Hus is, I would say, interwoven with the Czech academic tradition as it's been propagated since the 1880s.
Thank you. Did the fate of academics working at universities in Germany during the Nazi era change after 1945? So much so that at one point these academics may have been investigated after 1945, given that they did not actively resist the Nazis.
So at the very beginning in 1945, I think there was a hope of really having a purge of people who were deeply involved in the Nazi regime, and but a couple of problems took place. One was that it was carried out by the Allies, by American, British, French, and Soviet forces who didn't really know the situation on the ground. And it went forward for a few years, involved some medical professors, for example, who were involved in these inhuman. In fact, there was a whole trial that took place in Nuremberg of medical professors. There was a trial that took place of judges, so basically legal professors. But then when the Cold War arose in 1947, there was pressure on both sides to reintegrate, not just professors, but all kinds of professionals into the new orders. And so people after that point, 1947, 48, they cast a blind eye to the wartime record of a lot of people and real collaborators. I mean, people who really had done horrible things were reintegrated into the political economic systems of both states. So I would say before 1948, there was an effort to try to deal with this past, and this went on essentially to the late 1950s. And then there was in West Germany, at least, not East Germany. In West Germany, there was a kind of a reawakening, a recognition that there were still a lot of former Nazis active in German society, and new trials took place. Some of these people were professors, but by and large, I would say what happened was that by the early 1950s, Nazi professors, former Nazis, were reintegrated into the universities. They contributed their knowledge. They retired at some point, and then a new generation took over in the 1960s. So how shall I put it? I mean, the former Nazis were useful for operating the universities because there were so many of them. And then then they retired, and we have, I think, the relatively liberal order that we have today. It's a strange sort of story, right? Because you see how former Nazis were used actually to create a liberal democratic order. But that is indeed what happened. Chancellor Adenauer in the 1950s simply said, we don't have other people that we can do this with. He was not a Nazi. He was a center party leader. He was a Democrat. So the Democrats, liberals, social democrats, Christian Democrats, realized they needed to use former Nazis to build democracy.
Thank you. Could it be that the reason why student movements are not very visible in the East Germany is that Germany took over very serious destruction after the war was over? So much so that the fear of communism and totalitarian regimes can be extreme among these students.
Yeah, I hope I didn't sound too judgmental when talking about these students. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that they could see what happened to a whole range of non-communist student leaders like Nathanek. When somebody just disappears from the street, nothing's heard of them. I mean, that sends a certain message. It sends a chill into the university, among university students. 1953, has to be said that East Germans as a whole, including some students, actually rose up against the regime on June 17th of 1953, and that uprising was brutally crushed with the use of tanks. So I think again that had that taught a certain lesson, and until 1961, it was possible for East Germans to legally leave East Germany. They would just go to they would go to Berlin, East Berlin, and they would take the train, take the subway to West Berlin, and they were gone. And a lot of students did that. So essentially they made a calculation, to have relative peace and quiet. And as you say, it's a time of devastation, of rebuilding, get their university degrees and then leave. And that's what a lot of them did. I should say at the same, looking at Poland as a comparative example, is that the authorities there, they knew that the population was deeply anti-communist in the way that the East German or Czech populations were not. And so I think they were more careful to stage these sort of terror activities and measures against university students and professors. They did take place, but not to the same extent. I think what the Soviet authorities did with those students is to this day, when you read about it, it's chilling. It had an effect. There was no tolerance for any kind of dissent, so it was crushed, quite simply. And student behavior is in that sense understandable.
For our last question, what is the role of the so-called Hitler Youth in the universities before and during the war?
Well, it's actually the case that students who entered the university were already in the Hitler Youth, and the women were in something called the Union of German Girls. The students then, they joined actually university party organizations in many cases. I don't have the data in front of me, but they were very, very popular, very well supported. And before 1933, there was a very strong Nazi organizations at German universities. So I think that the dominant trend among students, if you had gone, for example, there are very good movies about the White Rose resistance. If you watch the movies, you'll see Sophie Scholl sitting in a big lecture hall, and there'll be lots of young men in brown shirts with Nazi party insignias. So the Hitler Youth was the organization that German young people. There's some dispute about whether they were forced to join, but the fact is about 90 to 95% of young Germans did join the Hitler Youth. And those who went to university, of course, were the university attendance was predicated upon their evident loyalty to the regime. So they continued to be organized, and of course the regime trained them in paramilitary activities. The young men, of course, if they were at university, they got military training, and they were taken away for military service during the war. So the universities, how shall we put it, they were instrumentalized for the sake of the Nazi war effort. And they, as I said, the resistance was relatively little, but it did exist. And this White Rose movement, it was situated in Munich. There are two good movies about it, and you'll see if you watch one of the first movie that came out in the early 1980s. I think it's simply called The White Rose. You see that the students are traveling all over southern Germany and parts of Austria with these leaflets. They have friends as far away as Saarbrücken and other places. So it was pretty widespread, but it was also pretty quickly subdued. So anyway, there's good literature. A friend of mine, Michael Grüttner, has written very, very well about Nazi students, Nazified students, the Gruttner. And if you're interested in other literature, by the way, on any of these subjects I've talked about, please just send me an email and I'll be happy to make some suggestions.
Dear Professor, thank you very much for this wonderful talk and for answering the questions from the participants. Especially in these difficult times our university is going through. We are extremely happy that you agreed to do an event with us. I think it was a very useful and informative program for the participants. I hope that this bad situation we are in will end as soon as possible and we can regain our academic freedom. We wish to have the honor of making an event with an important historian like you in another program in future. Thank you so much to you and everyone who participated.
Well, I can only thank you and wish you well. And please write if you have any questions or concerns. I'll be happy to make suggestions for reading if that's helpful.
Mm-hmm.